welcome to Lone Star P3 Live. My name is Kate Greer, and with me today are two leaders with a relentless focus on rural communities. We'll spend the next hour exploring all things rural education, the good, the bad, and the amazing. I've got a set of questions, as always, to get us started. And if you have questions, please feel free to drop them into the chat, and we'll get to as many as we can later in today's conversation. I want to begin today by learning a little bit more about our guests. Dreama and Charlie, can you introduce yourselves and talk a little bit about your role and why you do what you do? Dreama, we can start with you.
Yeah, start. Thank you for having me. So, Dreama Gentry, I grew up in Appalachia, Kentucky, in rural Appalachia, and I still live there. And rural has always been core to what I do. But education is what broke the generational cycle of poverty for me. And so after practicing law for a bit, I actually started going back and working in my home community to say, how can I actually change the systems and provide opportunities for young folks? So that was 30 years ago. So this has been a 30-year journey. About 4 years ago, the journey moved from working directly in Appalachia, Kentucky to working nationally. And so with Partners for Rural Impact, the goal is to ensure that all rural young people have a path to economic mobility. So we work across the country creating a movement of rural leaders, rural young people that are really focused on that. And then how do we activate funding for them? How do we strengthen the rural places? But also, how do we change the narrative of rural to one where we actually talk about rural brilliance? So it's great to be with you today.
Thanks, Dreama. And with us also is Charlie Glover from the T.L.L. Temple Foundation. Charlie, tell us a little bit about you.
Well, again, thank you so much for having me, and I'm glad to be here with you as well, Dreama. Charlie Glover, I'm the president and CEO of the T.L.L. Temple Foundation. We're based out of Lufkin, and the foundation exists to build a thriving East Texas. And so our service territories cover really from Texarkana down to Beaumont. It's 23 counties in Texas, and then one into Arkansas and Miller County. By way of introduction, my background has been primarily in education. So I grew up in College Station, Texas. I was a beneficiary of our public school system. I went to Texas A&M. I started recruiting teachers and ended up recruiting myself into the classroom. And so my introduction out of Texas A&M was in a classroom and teaching in Durham, North Carolina. I trained teachers and helped write elements of supporting in the curriculum in the district, and also led our social studies department during that time. And then I went on to study in my post-bac in education. And during that time, I had the opportunity to come back to Texas. And I came back and had the opportunity to lead an education nonprofit in the Metroplex. I led that organization for some years before going to work in centralized administration in Dallas Independent School District, and then an opportunity to do some work with Bellwether Education Partners before going to the Meadows Foundation. So that kind of brings us to something very aligned to the work that we're doing today, which is that work in philanthropy and the intersection of education in Texas. The Meadows Foundation covers 254 counties, and so a good portion of our work, about a quarter of our work, was happening in rural communities. And then the opportunity came up, and the privilege of a lifetime, to go lead the T.L.L. Temple Foundation. And so coming back onto that piece of it, existing since 1962, and we're serving in a lot of different areas. I know we'll talk a little bit about that today, but education is certainly at the crux of one of those, in addition to economic mobility, as we just touched on by Dreama. And so we're doing that work every single day in those communities, up to about 1.2 million rural residents across the service areas that we have. And I'm excited to talk about some of that work today and to learn as well.
Yeah, well, it's a big geography for T.L.L. Temple. And Dreama, I wonder about, you talked about Kentucky. Texas is not Kentucky. Tell me about the expansion into Texas for Partners for Rural Impact.
Yeah, so about 4 years ago, when we realized that the model that we have, cradle to career, thinking about young people and making sure they have that seamless support, that it would work nationally, we started thinking about where's the first place to test this. And so one of the mentors during this idea of should I take this and go national was Win Rosser, who at the time was the CEO of the T.L.L. Temple Foundation. And he was like, well, why don't you test in Texas, right? And so Texas was the first place. And I think it's important to note that as we thought about moving and going national, we were thinking of different models. One is how do we coach, provide technical assistance and support, but we also were thinking how do we actually take the cradle to career, the deep work from Appalachia and do that someplace. And so East Texas was the first place for that. And it really was because of the Temple Foundation. And so it's been a journey over the last 3 years. And I really appreciate the opportunity to work with partners and in a place where they recognized that we were learning something new And so over that 3-year period, we've shifted, right? And I think we're still in the process, and especially as the world changes, to think about what is PRI's contribution in East Texas, what is the local contribution. And so it's still evolving and a lot of fun. But that's how we ended up here, because of the T.L.L. Temple Foundation.
That's great. And Charlie, you talk about T.L.L. trying to create a thriving East Texas. Right. In the past, you've shared a metaphor with me that I think will stick with people about the role of fireworks versus the role of a horizon, and how you see the foundation's role in ensuring a more steady horizon. Could you share that?
Absolutely. And certainly some of the things that Dreama just touched on, I think, are a part of that conversation. So the T.L.L. Temple Foundation is a regional place-based funder, right? So I think that context is really important. And I shared that with you, through the size and the geographic boundaries that we have to our work. But it's also about the strategies in our work. So we're both doing responsive giving, so that's responding to things as they come across the line. When we look at things, in a particular example, that would look like food insecurity and our food banks and things of this nature. We're also trying to look beyond the horizon towards system change and where we can be a catalyst for the communities that we have the opportunity to serve. And so if you think about some of these investments that we've made over the years, and a lot of our other peers have as well, a lot of them are oftentimes showing what could be possible, right? When we get the right alignment, we have the right capital in play, or we have the right partners, we have the right folks in the community engaged. And that can be a firework. Right? It shows you what's possible. It illuminates the horizon for a period of time. I love fireworks. I know we all do. We all go to the 4th of July show or whatever it may be, and we walk away from that. But what it doesn't do is it doesn't keep that horizon lit. That is the metaphor you're referencing is a little bit, that's the sun as it rises, and it actually holds and it lights the entire horizon into perpetuity. So if I were to turn away from a horizon while the sun's coming up and then turn around, I see it's moving. But if I just watch, it doesn't feel like it's moving, right? And so this is the work that I think is harder. At times it feels more incremental, but it's aligned to the systems that ultimately increase those opportunities that we're also demonstrating through those examples, right? Those fireworks.
I want to dive more specifically into rural Texas and the opportunities here. Texas has more rural students than any other state in the nation. We have more than 1,000 school districts that are categorized as rural, and that offers a ton of opportunity to understand what's working. Dreama, I want to hear from you. What do you think is a particular strength of rural education that deserves more attention or gets overlooked? And how can that strength be leveraged as Texas and the nation think about improving outcomes for rural students in particular?
Yeah, and I think that when I think about rural schools, they are the heart of a community. And young people go to school and people know their name, and they can meet them where they are. And I think there's some recent research that just came out on personalized instruction and how do we make sure that every young person has the supports they need. So to me, rural schools are hardwired to do that. And I think the key piece is figuring out how do educators have the bandwidth to be great instructors, how do schools have the bandwidth to have others in the school that are actually supporting and connecting and doing that personalized connection with young people. And then also, how do you have the connection to the community, and make sure that those in the community that also want to lean in are able to. So to me, that's the promise, is that we know that in the rural schools, they're hardwired to center students, and they can be that center of community. Yeah. It's just hard to make that happen because of systems at times. Sometimes that gets in the way of what's best.
Mm-hmm. Charlie, Dreama touched on bandwidth, and that often being a limitation or something to solve for. I know you've pushed back in the past on rural communities being undercapitalized and instead thinking about it as or lacking capacity, and you reframe more as this concept of over-extraction. Yeah. What does that mean, and how can more urban folks make sense of what's happening in rural Texas and why there are some of these bandwidth issues at hand?
Yeah, building Dreama's point, I think schools play such a critical role in this, and they play a critical role in that for the same reason they play a critical role in any community across the state of Texas. In addition, in communities where there are less resources or they have been undercapitalized over a period of time, meaning invested in, both from a population size and from the resource component, that can lead to obviously lower amounts of capacity, but I think the push on that is the why. And then when we start talking about lower amounts of capacity, it can make it seem as it's a pejorative term, that there are not resources and assets in our rural communities that are, I would say, are even an advantage when we look across the rest of the communities in the state of Texas. Those things include, but are not limited to, a persistence and a grit that is pervasive across these communities, having done more with less. When we look at some of our rural communities in Texas, like even in the Rio Grande Valley, when we see some amazing results across a lot of rural communities at a much lower cost per an investment in those communities, that is raising up the work that's happening there regardless of resources. So a lot of times when we say, well, we have less capacity in these communities, yes, that can be true, and the question is why. And then I think when we answer that, it allows us to think. In a way that what would be the greatest leverage to increase that capacity now. If we see the communities that we serve and the community leadership that makes up those communities, which PRI has been doing a lot of work with, we're doing a lot of work of, as the asset to be listened to, what is our role now as a catalytic listener that is a bridge for trust into what are assets versus a catalytic actor because assets don't exist, right? And these two things, they may seem like a semantic, but they're really not, especially in communities that have been chronically underestimated or underrepresented. In this case, we're talking about rural communities. And as I think that that's a role that we have the opportunity to play. But I've also been in the communities that we're serving at Temple for the last 7 months. So I don't know what I don't know. And the more I know, the less I know. And I think that that's actually a really important way to engage in the communities that we're serving because I'm really taking away more than I think that we're providing at this point. And as we move forward in our own strategic planning process over the next few months, this will be at the forefront of how we're thinking about our communities as assets and how we are catalysts from a trust and a listening standpoint.
Yeah. And can I just sort of chime in there too on I like what you said about grit and resilience, but also the bandwidth often, and I'll speak here for Appalachia, I always go back and I'm using examples because that's where I'm from, right? In Appalachian schools, you have superintendents driving the school bus. You have teachers that are teaching too many classes and too many students. Yeah. You see in rural schools a lack of investment. Philanthropy, I think the most recent data from the Fed is 3 cents on a dollar goes to rural communities, but also public funding streams in some places also are not supporting rural places. Yep. So I really think, yes, we have resilience, but we shouldn't have to be so dang resilient. There needs to be more investment in rural schools, in rural communities. Because if you have the investment, then you have more people actually working with young folks, and we sometimes skip that part. Yeah. Thinking about how do we actually put more people in the schools working with young folks.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we will get to school finance and ramifications of rural funding later on in our conversation today. But I hear you, and there's a little bit of like, just because I'm gritty doesn't mean that I should constantly be forced to use the grit. Yeah. I want to talk about student outcomes, and I think there's always a tension of like maybe sometimes inadvertently making excuses for certain parts of the state that may be undercapitalized or overlooked, like, well, they're dealing with too many other things, so their reading rates will only sit at X, or we can't ask for post-secondary or career training to do all of the things. And there has been a big shift over the past several years in disrupting that mindset. I know Dreama Partners for Rural Impact pays close attention to student outcomes and how we make sure that opportunities are available to students in rural communities. Can you tell me a little bit about continuous improvement for PRI, how you test hypotheses? Things look different even across different rural communities. I'm sure you've seen this in East Texas too, right? So I'm curious, when rural communities can look so vastly different, how do you test hypotheses? What do you look for success? And how do we continue to hold high standards and high expectations for kids across our country?
Wow, that's a lot. I'll start with the piece around the outcomes. And so the model that we're looking at and what we use is this idea of cradle to career. And we really believe in evidence and evidence-based practices. And we know that if young people are going to be economically mobile, they need the pathway to that is entering kindergarten ready to learn, reading at grade level at 3rd grade, 8th grade numeracy, graduating high school, I say college and career ready, a post-secondary degree or credential, and then moving into meaningful work. And so part of our work is helping communities realize where are their young people on this path at this point, right? How many kindergartners are actually entering ready to learn? How many third graders are reading at grade level? And then I think it is working in community. And so a lot of what we're sharing with communities is the practices of results-based leadership and really results-based accountability, of taking that third grade reading number, putting it out and sharing it in community, looking at and disaggregating the data. You know, one of the things we found in some of our Kentucky schools was the further you live from the county seat, the lower third grade reading was, right? Because there was no transportation to any out-of-school programs, right? So it's just really interesting. So I do think, first we have to keep folks having the high expectations. You can love kids to death, right? You can make excuses and care about them and not hold them to high expectations. And so I think the first piece is we have to anticipate and expect that every young person meets those benchmarks. Then we have to sit with community, help them ask the questions, the 7 whys. Why this, and then actually come up with the strategies. And that's the localization. That's the actual piece then that the community can determine what's holding third grade reading back or what could push it forward. And it's taking the time for the process. And I think it goes back again to the bandwidth locally. Often folks are so overextended in their roles, and even the moms and dads are so extended trying to survive. How do you actually make community and provide time for folks to come together and look at the data and work on the strategies?
We had a question from the audience, and either one of you can field this. Rates of chronic absenteeism and dropout risk are slightly higher than the state average in rural communities. Very practically, are there strategies that work in rural Texas to solve for this, and what does that look like?
So I'll take a stab at it, and actually it's interesting. One of the communities and one of that we've worked in over the last couple of years, their indicator they really wanted to focus on was chronic absenteeism. And you know, if you're looking for strategies that work, Attendance Works is the national organization I turn to for the strategies. But what they actually taught us several years ago when we started working with them is it's actually pulling the folks together in that community, looking at the attendance rates for each high school, actually, not even and each school, bringing parents together, bringing educators, listening, right? Because we have a lot of mental models on why kids don't show up at school. But if you bring the parents together, bring the community together, you start to hear what it is, then coming up with a community-based approach to moving that. There's not a silver bullet for chronic absenteeism, and it'll look different across different rural communities, but there are some best practices out there. And I think, again, it's the approach. It's using the data and the approach that we find work. And in that one community, they had significant gains in significant improvement in chronic absenteeism, even over the course of a year. And one of the things that they told us that really helped was there were people in the schools, community school coordinators, that were calling parents and following up, talking to a superintendent yesterday. And he was like, you know, just the fact that they were calling and saying, hey, did you know? Why are they not here? What can we do to help? That really helped.
I bet that's an asset for rural Texas in particular, because that personal connection, those are trusted voices.
Yeah, absolutely. You're also, just to build on that, you're looking at different, we talked about the undercapitalization from an infrastructure standpoint. And, you know, showing up is half the battle in a lot of parts of life. But a lot of our rural communities, West Sabine ISD being one of these, is drawing students in from double-digit miles away, right? So transportation's actually a really key component here, where it looks a little bit different in rural communities. The other thing I would tack on there, and she's referencing some of the success that's been made in chronic absenteeism in Diboll ISD, which was a significant town from the Temple family and the Temple Foundation's perspective, at the headquarters of the Temple corporate interest for some period of time. That's a town that's obviously shifting, right? It's going through a lot of different machinations, as are a lot of rural communities that have been a part of those economic booms. And so thinking about how that district is now serving and where it's serving and what makes it relevant for getting into our schools really, really matters. And it's academics and That's the things that Dreama was talking about previously, right? In being the civic center, in being that convening component, it's that much more, expansive. And when you're making that a part of the chronic absenteeism conversation as well, because the student and the entire family are benefiting, that's also a major leverage point in rural communities.
And it's also making sure that young people have a reason to want to come to school. Some of the disaggregated data on why we improved chronic absenteeism in a Kentucky district was the days that they had art class after school and in school. Actually, the attendance rates were higher. Mm-hmm. And when they started asking young people, they're like, well, so Miss So-and-so is here today, and I want to actually see her because she lets me touch things and she lets me play instruments and do this. And that would never have occurred to us, right? But I think, again, how do we actually draw young people and pull them into school versus saying you have to be there?
And we were talking about data earlier too. Data is wholly necessary and totally insufficient for closing all of the gaps on these things, right? So I'm really clear about that, right? Like it has to exist. It is an important driver of these things. But if there's not a relative plug-in as to the why for communities that are already under-resourced, or it's 18 miles to get to school, whatever the case may be in some of these situations, then the execution of that, meaning the increase in that absenteeism rate in the case of this particular metric we're talking about, but the same thing applies to literacy, the same thing applies to college or career, military readiness, so on and so forth. That relativism is incumbent upon us to ensure that we're creating that for these families.
RP3 community is full of data nerds, and we like to understand what are the metrics of success, how do we know if things are moving, what does it look like to continuously improve? Charlie, to your point, like it is data and a lot of other things. So what are measures of success that you look for in rural communities to see if things are improving?
Well, I think you have the student level data, right, first and foremost. One of the things that we're struggling with is part of our work now is not working directly with the students like we used to in Appalachia, but it's actually supporting community-based organizations as they do that. So so I'm going with the challenge, not what's working. One of the things we're really challenged with is how do we know when the intermediary is actually leaning in and doing well. And so as I'm doing work in Yakima Valley in Washington, and we're providing coaching and technical support and capacity building, how do we know if that's actually helping? So that's a piece that we're still trying to figure out, and there's others who we're watching, but if any of your data nerds have suggestions on that, that's what we need.
Put it in the chat.
Because it's much easier to me to say, let's look at the student piece, let's look at periodic assessment, and let's see where they are on track. But then as organizations like ours that are doing this other work, how do we know we're bringing value? And we're still learning on that piece. And I think the work with Temple Foundation has helped us learn on that.
Yeah.
And we are very fortunate that we have such strong data structures in the state of Texas. We have a lot that we can work from. Lone Star being one of those components. Our educational research center, so on and so forth. What's interesting though is, and this is starting to get touched on, is how, and I said it before, how are we making that relative to the communities that data then impacts? We know from metadata, K-readiness, third grade literacy, right? Algebra by ninth grade. These are all really key leverage points that we can look at trends and peer review data and say, we know why that's important at a population level metric trend. And that is a fact, right? We know that right now. How that then plays out into the relative implementation, particularly in smaller communities, particularly where that community is tight-knit, how do you make it relative? Well, I think a part of the answer to that is livable wage, right? Is we're linking it to something. So when we think about a thriving East Texas and we're looking at education, economic mobility, health, human services, arts and culture, so on and so forth, one of the sustaining abilities for this is a life of dignity and access to and pulling down a livable wage. And then obviously those leverage points that I just talked about are really, really critical in actually reaching there. But if we're not making that connection point, if we're not thinking about the end of that pipeline and how it's relative to the communities that we serve, particularly rural communities that have traditionally been more extracted from than invested in, and then the only way that you're able to access that is then leave that community, right? So then you become another extraction from that community. Those are the kind of things that we've got to be thinking about that go beyond just the data point, but absolutely require the data point on that roadmap, if that makes sense.
Yeah. One of our original questions feels a bit silly to ask now, learning more in our conversation, which was just like, what support is helpful? Let me tell you what my hypothesis would be, and you guys can tell me if I'm right or wrong. But essentially, like, that varies widely from community. So, like, in some cases, it may be like, we need help with transportation, but it doesn't sound like that is a uniform solution in rural Texas. And so the role of identifying those supports, even though so many of us love, like, how do I fix this? Let's move on to the next problem because there are so many to tackle. It sounds like it's more complex than naming a support. Dreama?
I think it is. And I think the other piece, and I will share on Partners for Rural Impact, our success metrics are that rural young people are on the path to economic mobility. Some of our partners are actually, their success metrics are thriving places. Right? And I will say that there is sometimes a tension because you could have rural young people on a path to economic mobility. They could have no options at home. They could leave and the rural place could be doing worse. Right? And so when I first started doing this cradle to career work, I worked a lot with Jeff Canada, who does the Harlem Children's Zone. And that was the big sticky point for the first 3 years that we worked together. I'm like, Jeff, in Harlem, if you're successful, these young people can still live in Harlem and actually work and do any job they dream. But in Owsley County, Kentucky, then they may have to leave and Owsley County would actually decline. So I do think that a part of the equation we have to bring into this is young people and what do they want? And how do we actually bring young people into the discussion early on, as early as middle school, to start letting them see these are the careers locally, right? And, you know, one of the things that my sons challenged me is like, Mom, do rural young people really want economic mobility as the outcome? And I'm like, you're right. We need to check that. We need to continue to do it. So I think a piece of our work is also not doing to young people and to communities, but bringing them into the equation. Now, my piece is that a young person should graduate high school and have an option for college, for career, for the military. But they should have a real choice and a real option for all three. Because at that age, they can start to think which direction they want to go. And I know I took us on a tangent, but I think that's a big piece, right? It's around what are young people wanting, what are they saying, and how are they aware of what's local, what's available in their state, what's available across the nation for them.
Charlie, you work across education, philanthropy, the arts and culture, like you mentioned. What does it look like when rural schools, employers, local partners really come together and collaborate? Can you talk about the power of that? RP3, LONESTAR3 is similar in that we have practitioners, we've got researchers, we've got policy folks, and there's kind of a microcosm that exists in local communities. And what does it look like when that thrives?
I mean, it's interesting because this is also a highlight of the kind of capacity that we have in rural communities to work from. One thing that comes to mind is a group called DETCA. It's a conglomerate of state IHEs, institutions of higher education, local institutions of higher education. Right now it has 6 school districts inside of it that have come together, working with the community, working across school districts, working through the institution of higher education structure to band together and access that CCMR approach. And alone, they would not be able to access near what they have the ability to draw down. But what they're doing is they're allowing students inside of each one of these districts to access different programs in peer districts, right? And so then they are coming together and they're actually able to leverage one another instead of compete with one another, if that makes sense. And so you've got people in Jasper ISD accessing something in Burkeville ISD, Kirbyville accessing something in Jasper. And then that allows them to move together towards one common goal. It allows a lot of folks to be in the room because they're attaching that to a livable wage of a high demand. So that's LVNs, there'll be a lineman component that will be added to that soon. And I think when we look into the future, those things are critical because we know pathways look different for everybody, but the pathways need to exist. So I understand Dreama's perspective on going in earlier and asking youth what they want to exist. And we need to be able to show them what could exist as well, right? And so doing both of those things, I think will allow us to, one, prepare a better talent pipeline, be more relative for the populations we serve, and then ultimately keep and then build, this is the thriving component, right, in those communities. What we know, what we don't want is a bridge to be to nowhere, right? Whether that is in your own community, we do not want to graduate people to the couch, right? Like that's we're not setting anyone up for success, either the tax bases in the communities in which we serve or the individuals themselves. So examples like that, the really cool thing about that work, and I've got a great team doing a lot of this work. Some of them might be with us today. Dr. Sylvia Leal, Dr. Betsy Mijares, Melanie Coakley on my team. They're thinking about these things and how they all play out across not just schools, not just education. And it goes all the way back to it's the hub, right? These schools are the hub. And so I think those can be concrete examples. And can we have a SETCA, Southeast Texas version of that, right? And that's the last thing I'll add in on this is rural communities aren't monolithic. And while Dreama is here representing a national lens and her experience and lived experience is Appalachia, and I'm here representing East Texas, even that, the area that we cover is about the size of the state of South Carolina. So there's a lot of differences inside of each one of these things and how that could play out. And if we have these cohorts and these collaboratives, and we have that mindset and skill set, it can take advantage of what the next thing is, right? We don't have to just plan for today. Now we can actually plan for what the future workforce is. And that's not always a conversation that's equated with rural communities, and it should be.
Yeah. And I love we don't want to bridge to nowhere or graduate people to the couch. And I think the other piece around the workforce is we also don't want employers to drop into a place and not have the young people that are ready for that opportunity, right? Yeah. So a piece of it is, how do we get better at the marketing? So if we know an employer is coming in, how do we make sure those elementary kids, those middle school kids, they have a chance to actually want that job? Mm-hmm. And I think we forget to use that muscle to actually think about, it's about inspiring the young people to want to do that work, or want to have that job. And we forget that. And I come from an extraction coal economy place. Coal company was great at that because people who were there back during their heyday, they wanted those jobs and they believed in that. Yep. And the kids were like, I'm going to do this. And they've made a living wage. But we forget that piece. So I think it's also not dropping, it's creating that excitement for the jobs too, locally.
Yep.
Yeah, a job that comes up a lot is actually the role of teacher. And we have a question in the chat right now. Temple Foundation and so many other rural funders have really rallied around teacher retention, quality teachers, particularly as a tool to improve student outcomes. The question from the group is, how much is teacher retention in and of itself a problem that kind of trickles out into other aspects, and how does philanthropy grapple with that?
Well, how do we all grapple with it? I think, right, as one piece, because it's not just teacher retention, it's teacher preparation. Mm-hmm. I think people that are prepared to go into any career and are successful at that career, that's actually your highest marker for retention, is actually people feeling successful in the roles that they're trying to execute. When I sit down with the rural superintendents I've had the opportunity to have conversations with over the last few months, after I ask a series of questions, one of the last questions I ask is, what's keeping you up at night, right? Like, strategy aside, any errors aside, what's keeping you up? And sometimes that answer is, we're not hiring teachers, we're preparing them, meaning we are really faltering on the preparation front end of this process. And I think that that's a huge contributor to the downstream effect that you just talked about, which is retention, right? And so the answer is, we're trying to think around that, but we're trying to think around it in both meeting the needs in the immediacy, which means we need to open our mind to what those pathways could actually look like, but maintain quality. The soft bigotry of low expectations doesn't just apply to some of the student populations we just talked about. It applies to a component of what we know to be one of the most important professions in the United States. It's also a high demand. It's a high demand right now, and we can be thinking about leveraging other pathways through other IHE partners, through other public funding sources to incentivize our top talent to be going into these pathways. But I go back to, if we're not preparing these individuals well, and then we see this retention issue as a part of that, and then we're not seeing student outcomes move where we might want to see them move, I think that that's just a critical lever in this component. For us, we've been able to work with a number of different programs. Right now, we're working with a project with the New Teacher Project across the state. And as I mentioned, Dr. Leal and Dr. Miharis and our team have been a part of that effort. We've worked with I believe it was ESC 7 as well in building out a teacher preparation pipeline program and support there. And it's absolutely critical. And it's anything to be addressed. We talked about the sun versus the fireworks. This is the sun coming up, right? Are we willing to do what it takes to ensure that we have the most outstanding people in our communities going into the teaching force prepared well and supported in that process? And I think that is going to change retention. I mean, you know these stats better than I, but close to 50% of our new teachers across the state of Texas were hired uncertified last year. I mean, it's not that it's a guarantee that a certified teacher is going to be there. We'll have different levels of quality, but that is a trend that we cannot ignore. And I think it contributes to retention, and it's something that we're investing in right now.
Yeah, and one of the LONESTARP3 partners did a ton of research on this and the role of quality preparation.
Yes.
It's lovely when something that is intuitive to all of us bears out in quantitative data as well.
That was out of Texas Tech.
That was out of Texas Tech. That's right. Yeah.
An amazing Lone Star P3 partner, and that work is both devastating and incredibly significant.
Yeah. Dreama, I want to shift. Texas has done a lot over the past 6-7 years as it relates to school funding. We could talk about teacher preparation and the changes that the legislature made in 2025 to ensure that we were throttling down uncertified teachers and increasing pathways and supports for high quality teacher preparation programs and things like residency models, things that the data is very clear work to help teachers feel supported and then come down into student outcomes. All of those also carry a rural funding kicker, right? There is more money if you're in a rural part of the state. You have the unique position to be a national lens here and probably watching how some of the school finance is playing out in other states and Texas. What do you make of Texas's approach to rural kickers in the finance formula?
So I think that you guys are the gold standard at this piece, and that other states that are thinking about doing this are looking at Texas.
Can you say that one more time? You're very proud.
You are, and you should be, right? Because, and you've done it and you've recognized rule, but you also have done it that applies across all schools. I do think that people are watching and they're wanting to replicate. And I think that part of this is how do we actually make the bandwidth to be able to share with other places that are doing that. I do think on the rural side, and we've talked about this, Charlie, is how do we also make sure that that bandwidth of rural schools to actually take advantage of every dollar that comes their way. I think there's still challenges there. But I do think you all will figure that out, and that will actually also help other places across the country too.
I think those collaboratives like the Debt Kit that I mentioned before, where they were not going to be able to leverage into some of these great opportunities our state provides, and by coming together and being able to leverage off each other's assets in that low infrastructure environment, I mean, that model is bearing out in a very, very effective way, and I hope that it's something we can continue to grow, and learn from. Not something to do to a community, but with a community.
And I think that's how we have a goal now to start thinking together about opportunity youth and how do you re-engage opportunity youth. And I think that financing piece is a key piece that we think that is a good thing to test here in Texas.
And I'll throw one more out there that's very exciting. So the Rural Health Transformation Program that came out of the recent budget, the state of Texas is going to get close to $2.81 billion for that. Well, one of the 4 initiatives on that, and someone who has been on my team and is transitioning to Torch here, is going to be helping implement that, is pathway work in the healthcare space. This is a federal healthcare bill. It's not an education bill, if you will, right? The state of Texas is going to be drawing down a significant amount, and that is for rural communities of 68,500 or less in a county, and pathways is one of the 4 initiatives. For us in the education data, a system, take whatever term we want, That is so exciting to see. And what's going to have to be a part of executing that pathway? It's going to have to be our K-12 LEAs. It's going to have to be our institutions of higher education. So it's not just point of service healthcare conversation. It's a pathway conversation.
And that in and of itself is some catalytic capital because of how Texas has structured its finance formulas. With outcomes funding for community colleges, with outcomes bonuses for high schools.
It aligns perfectly. So we're very excited about that in the communities that we serve and are eligible for those dollars.
I love that. Charlie, you touched on this, but you've also said everyone has a plan for East Texas except for East Texas. And part of the foundation's reflections and recognizing that and making sure that this is a plan built alongside East Texans, hearing from them. How do you balance? We talked about this a little bit earlier, but like young people, when I was a young person, I didn't care how much I made. I wanted to follow a passion, and my life looks differently now, and I needed to make enough to support a family. So there's this balance. I wonder, when you zoom out beyond just young people and to rural communities, how do you balance the desire, like what we know is actually needed for a community to thrive and what community members are voicing, like, this is what we need right now? Or is there even a delta?
Yeah, I think there is, right? And I think there's a delta in any of the communities across, the United States. I think the delta that's interesting with rural, from the limited observation and what I've been able to learn both from my peers and the communities we're serving, and I'm going to go back to the term you said, right, which is that everyone has a plan for rural East Texas except for rural East Texans. Well, what that means is, the amount of calls that I've received from folks that are not in our community to describe what should be done in our community it's interesting, right? And those are all coming from a very good place. I think that rural's having a moment right now. Like, there's a reason we're sitting here right now, right? And rural's having a moment for a lot of reasons. But the outcome of that needs to be, how will rural communities benefit and grow from that moment, right? Not a system that those communities are now supposed to serve, but how a system can serve them. And so I think that is a part of a conversation that if our rural communities, and that includes, but is certainly not limited to our respective organizations, are not at the front end of that conversation, then we should not expect an outcome that's driven by the populations that are most impacted by these things. There are a lot of topics out there right now about that. Certainly in our state, water is one of those topics. We also have a once-in-a-generation investment coming in water infrastructure. That's a whole other pathway conversation that can be very exciting. But without these communities in these rural settings being the ones who are driving that conversation, I do not think there is a sustainable path to some of the things that we would want to see change from a population level metric standpoint. It's a learning, it's a hard learning. It's a learning that I think we've had in philanthropy across the board. What's the next iteration of what in the past we have always seen as a really, really effective model and collective impact, or what that might be? What's the next iteration of that from an implementation standpoint in communities that have been left out of the conversation for so long, but not just left out of the conversation, literally had their natural resources extracted during that process as well, and not benefited in the same way. So those are very real things I think have to be a part of the conversation. I'll put a plug in here for Texas Rural Funders, which is, I think, a great organization that's come together at this moment of rural having its moment, that I think is one of those kind of examples of representation. I don't know the exact statistic, but I think less than 1% of total giving philanthropic space is going to rural areas.
3%.
Sorry, less than 3%. And so there are a lot of folks galvanizing around that conversation right now. I think Texas Rural Funders is a good example of that. Again, necessary, but not sufficient. We actually need the communities that we're serving, the county judges, the superintendents, individuals who are involved in our water infrastructure systems. They're the ones that need to be at the table as well.
And I think that the real complexity too is, I think you're right, the communities are not often in the discussion. But then when community comes into discussion, how do we make sure that the proximate voice of those most marginalized are in that discussion?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I think often we're thinking, well, we had community representation, but it was positional power representation, perhaps not those that are closest to and struggling the most. And so that's something that we continually do.
Yeah.
We have a piece where we say, who are the community champions? Who are the trusted folks in the community that folks go to when they need things that really can give you the pulse of the community.
That's right.
And it's hard to remember to have them in the conversation. And a good friend of mine who worked with me for several years would say, you know, we work in places of generational poverty, but in places of generational poverty, you also have generational power.
Uh-huh.
And we have to remember that, because sometimes the community might be at the table, but is it really the community voice?
And we have not done an amazing job at that.
I don't
right?
think anybody
I mean,
has. I don't
yeah,
think any of
and
us
that's what I mean. That's the proverbial. And you even said, like, sometimes it's hard to remember. It shouldn't be, right? Like, that's actually where we should be starting. And again, because, you know, in this situation, we're all having its moment, like, there is no reason that we can't learn from the past and begin implementing that, you know, intentionally, which I know that we certainly are, but we need to expand that and open up that table.
Yeah. I wonder, Dreama, what are some examples, or can you tell a story about when PRI brought new resources, new capacity into an area and the impact that had?
And so the easiest story is around, we're really good at federal grants and federal dollars. And actually, we built all of our work in Kentucky on that, of how do you bring these public dollars into communities. And so in even the last 3 years of East Texas, being able to bring in Department of Education community school funding into one small district, $2.5 million over 5 years, that then actually hires local people as community coordinators and does that work with kids every day. Mm-hmm. So that's one example. We also have a multi-state AmeriCorps program that serves multiple states, including Texas and East Texas. And the goal with that program as it's launched is how do we actually provide opportunities for young people to serve during their senior year of high school, where they actually would get a small ed award and be actually in there teaching and learning about the teaching pathway, which is really exciting, mm-hmm. but also residents. So for us, it's primarily been how do we bring in the complex federal grants that rural districts couldn't secure themselves, but then we actually can help with the management.
Yeah. And I want to lift up PRI on this too. The resources that have come into our region through the frameworks and structures that they have built out over decades, and their work in Appalachia, would not be coming into those communities without that. And that's one example. We have other partners like Communities Unlimited in different ways that have been able to bring some of those things to bear. And I think that there's a really exciting national rural network and conversation happening right now where we're able to learn from one another on these fronts. And that's another thing that I'd like to lift up PRI on. We have 5 core values of the foundation. One of them is learning and continuous improvement. This work is incredibly hard. We would have all made more progress, I think, in the things that matter most to us if there was one recipe, right, for whatever a solution might be. And you mentioned this before, but if we move forward with a set of operating hypotheses and partners that take, no matter what we hit an outcome or don't hit desired outcome, can we take a learning away from that and get 1% better the next day? Sometimes I think in philanthropy, we have to say and feel that everything is a home run every single time. That is not the case. It's not the case in life. It's not the case in the corporate world. It's not the case in the public world. And it's certainly not the case when we're trying to work on some of the most intractable problems that we've all been trying to solve for generations. So coming into that with honesty and openness and an understanding that we actually don't have answers, we actually need to be partners in helping build them. And then when things need to pivot or we can learn from it, how are we disseminating that just as vociferously as we disseminate a win, if that makes sense? PRI has been an amazing partner in how we think about that, and I'm excited about some of those other partnerships that drive that way. And I think that's very important, particularly in rural communities.
Well, because when you can elevate those missed opportunities, or not quite getting it right, there's learning that expands beyond just your organization or your network.
Absolutely. And I think that in this relationship, the Temple Foundation has been open to us saying, hey, we just didn't nail it this time. Mm-hmm. And maybe we didn't do a very good job, right? And I think, how do other funders learn that? Because you always say it, right? They always say it. We want to learn the learnings, but you have to trust. And I think that's the relationship piece. And so there are things, especially coming into East Texas as our first place, where we deeply were in after Appalachia, lots of learnings, let's just say that. But being able to share those and know that that doesn't mean that they're going to say, well, you guys just are not doing a good job. So it's been great.
Yeah, that theme of trust continues to show up in this, right? It takes a lot of vulnerability to say, thanks for the money, I missed the mark, and having that space where you can adjust and use that as an asset instead of a deterrent.
Yep, absolutely.
Charlie, I want to turn the question that you ask your superintendents at the end of every meeting back to you, which is what keeps you up at night? And you're going to go first, and Dreama will answer the same question, but she'll have a bit of time to think.
What keeps me up at night, just to answer that really straightforward, is we moved to Lufkin in pretty short order. And in order to all get in one place, we live in a very small location for our family, 4 and our dog right now. So what keeps me up at night is anyone moving around, because we're all, right there. But yeah, that's right. But I think what keeps me up at night is I feel an incredible burden, and I think all of us should, in philanthropy. And because of the way these dynamics are set up, this is something that we also need to hold ourselves to and create for ourselves, with the responsibility and privilege that we've been given in this part of the work, because we all have a different role in it. And it would be disingenuous for me to say that philanthropy, one, is doing the work, or that we are the ones that have the answers for the work to be done. I think that can become an archetype. And I think I carry a very, very heavy burden on my shoulder to say, how can we not be that? And how can we still be a part of moving the ball forward on whatever that progress might look like? How can I use 2 ears and 1 mouth? And how can I be that leverage point? Because sometimes I hear, philanthropic entities will be very excited about how many resources went out. That's really important. That's an important input. But sometimes we celebrate that as if it's an outcome. And so what are our outcomes actually going to be? And can we be okay with it being both either the movement for the population we're serving and the learning, as that invariably doesn't go from point A to B to C to D like we might hope. So those are the kind of things that I try to think about and ensure that every resource that we're putting out is moving towards one of those outcomes for the populations who need it most. Because a kid that isn't having a high quality lesson today doesn't get that day back, right? I mean, that's one example. We could apply that to someone that doesn't have access to health care, whatever those things may be. What's our role in that? And are we waking up every day trying to move that ball forward? Those are the kind of things that keep me awake on top of the sounds in the house.
So I have 2. I think the first is federal dollars are a lifeline to rural communities, and they do and provide a lot of the supports that are safety nets that are supporting schools, students, and families. And that worries me, that I feel that that's under attack, and we've seen that. So the federal landscape and the lack of federal investment in kids and families, rural and urban, keep me up at night. And the second is, I'm a mom, and I have a 21-year-old and a 26-year-old. And they've had a lot of opportunities, and they continue to have a lot of opportunities. But I also see in them a lack of hope for their future and their nation and their country, lack of connection to community. We talk about the loneliness epidemic that especially young men, but I think also our young women are struggling with. And that keeps me up. It's that, how do we build hope and connection and support young folks in that piece? And I think that's squishier, because what's the data points, right? And 3rd grade reading in a way is easier to tackle, and we're still struggling with it. So how are we going to make sure that the loneliness epidemic and the hopelessness, that's the piece when I really get, because even if my kids who have had all the supports are still struggling with it, what about kids who don't have those supports? And that keeps me up.
A clarion call for thriving communities to have connection, to have a baseline of ability, right? And to make sure that the foundation is really strong there.
And that all kids see their place and feel honored and held. And I think we're in a place where a lot of kids are not. So that keeps me up.
Dreama, I want to finish. We are wrapping up on time, but if you could shift one thing over the next 5 years, let's put, by 2030, 2031, to unlock more opportunities for rural learners, let's focus on Texas. What would it be? And I think my favorite part of this question is, who needs to act first? Who's the first mover in making that happen?
I think it would be, and I'll put it on Charlie here as the mover, as the exemplar on this, because I think that 3% of all dollars going to rural communities is unconscionable. And I think in Texas, if there was greater percent of private philanthropic dollars going to rural places in a smart manner, you would see the outcomes move, because I think the systems are there. But it's how do we do that? And I think somebody has to step forward and show that if we invest more in rural places and we get that 3% number up, we'll see better outcomes. And it's you. It's leading the way in Texas. We'll come back 5 years from now.
I was following the first part of that question. Can you help me out with the second component of it?
Yeah. So think about this as your magic wand. If you want to unlock opportunities over the next 5 years, what needs to happen and who needs to move first?
Well, we all got to move in unison. Obviously, Dreama's already said it's us, right? And I think we have an outsized role to play in that. And I certainly see that as a part of our very real burden too. And so that's communication, that's showing up. I mean, there's a reason, I'm here today. And so I think that can be a component of it. But the bigger part, I think, is getting people to see the potential that exists in the communities that we serve. And I don't just mean the potential of agriculture, which a lot of people think rural and they think agriculture, right? Or the potential of, that's where I go camping. So I'm sharing some of these archetypes and even stereotypes about our communities. And I've had people visit where I live now and say, wow, I didn't know X, Y, Z, A, B, C. And they haven't even begun to completely engage in the amazing assets that are these communities. In addition, if we don't do and invest in some of the things we're talking about, we will lose those remaining assets. Mm-hmm. And in the same way that there are some of the challenges that are persistent, the same thing that caused those can continue. There's not a magical backstop to it, right? And so I think that being a voice for that, trying to expose that to the extent possible, while also being a listening ear to the communities that we're aiming to serve, I think that's actually the most critical thing that we can do. A large part of that, though, also falls onto our natural resources and having the state also understand what they benefit from, even though they don't fully understand those communities. And that's not everybody, because we have a very wide, diverse, large geographic expanse of rural populations in the state of Texas. But the outsized contributions that they're making to the state versus the contributions that are being made in those communities is a gap.
Well, that brings us to our time today. Charlie, Dreama, this was a great conversation. I very much appreciate it. To our LONESTAR3 community, thank you for tuning in today. Please keep up with us on social, on LinkedIn. Share this conversation with your friends and communicate with us via chat as you can. Thank you.